Happy Friday, everyone. I'm Mark Ammon from Quantum Regulatory Solutions, and I want to thank you for joining us for our webinar today. Our plan is to share some general information about FDA meetings and to include some approaches that we use to increase the likelihood of getting clear and actionable advice. We support many FDA meetings for our clients and feel that this is one of the most important things that we do. A little housekeeping before we get started. This session is being recorded, so it will be available to watch later. We find these sessions to be most valuable when we get questions from the attendees. So please note microphones are muted for all participants. So if you have any questions, please enter them in the comments section within LinkedIn. If we receive a question that fits within the flow of our conversation today, we'll try and address it in real time. However, I want to point out that there is actually a transmission delay that can be up to 2 minutes, which could impact our ability to address questions during the presentation. We will otherwise address questions during the Q&A at the end. If we don't have time for all of them during the webinar, we will do our best to respond directly to you afterwards. For our conversation today, I'm pleased to be joined by two talented regulatory colleagues and co-founders of Quantum Regulatory Solutions. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Mark Ammon. I'm trained as a clinical pharmacist. I've been working in the industry for more than 30 years. Along with Dawn and Mara, I co-founded Quantum Regulatory Solutions in May of 2023. I've worked on both sponsor and consulting sides of the business, and I have experience in many therapeutic areas, including psychiatry, neurology, cardiovascular, metabolic, inflammation, oncology, and dermatology. Prior to starting Quantum, I founded Catalyst Regulatory Services, which I successfully operated for 9 years until it was acquired in 2019. My focus is on building and leading regulatory teams and providing expert regulatory consulting services. To date, my teams and I have provided strategic guidance to more than 300 companies. Dawn Chitty is a highly experienced pharmaceutical scientist, regulatory affairs professional, and strategic leader who joined Quantum as Senior Vice President and co-founder. Dawn brings over 28 years of experience in the industry on both the sponsor and the consulting sides, with several years in international senior leadership positions, including managing regulatory affairs, project management, drug development, and business development teams. She has extensive experience with regulatory due diligence assessments, supporting both sellers and investors. Dawn excels at building client relationships and solving complex problems by deploying proven strategies to overcome business hurdles. Mara Hollinger is a highly skilled and accomplished regulatory expert who joined Quantum as Senior Vice President and co-founder in July of 2023. She brings over 25 years of industry experience, including 10 years of regulatory affairs experience on both the CRO and sponsor sides. With expertise in many therapeutic areas and a recent focus in oncology, Mara is adept at building and leading regulatory teams, managing drug and biologic development programs, and oversight of complex regulatory submissions. Mara has a successful track record of building and leading highly strategic regulatory teams. I mentioned at the start that we feel that FDA meetings are some of the most important things that we do as a regulatory professional. So I want to start off by asking the two of you, Mara and Dawn, if you can provide some thoughts on why that is as a foundation for the rest of our conversation.
Thanks, Mark. Meetings are one of the few opportunities sponsors have to establish a relationship with the review team at FDA. This is valuable even if you think your program is straightforward and there is existing precedent. Through your interactions with FDA, you may learn of new expectations due to either evolving science or potentially safety signals that FDA has seen with similar products that you're not aware of. FDA meetings can also speed development, which potentially reduce costs. A few years ago, FDA put out some statistics essentially showing benefits across all types of programs with interactions with the agency. It's hard to say that there's a direct correlation, but just as an example, they showed that sponsors who have pre-IND meetings cut almost 5 years off their overall development timeline when you were developing a product for a rare disease indication.
Thanks for that, Dawn. I wanted to also add that some other reasons to have a meeting with FDA include clarifying guidance. So FDA will often put out guidance for particular therapeutic areas or product types, but you might have a program that is unusual or different from what's been posted previously. So it's a good opportunity to clarify any guidance or if there's no precedent for your product, to seek some advice in terms of the product development. In addition, it can really help reduce regulatory risk and investor confidence. Sometimes you just need those FDA responses in writing.
So I know there's several different types of FDA meetings. Can you give us an overview of those and describe a little bit about what each one is for?
Sure. I'm going to talk about type A, B, and C meetings, but I'm actually going to start with the type B meetings as they're the most common. These are the milestone meetings, and they take place at very specific stages of development and have set timelines in terms of, submission materials and when the meeting can occur. And we'll talk later about the types of topics you'll tackle during these meetings. Type A meetings are typically limited to urgent situations. The examples of the types of situations that might come up are a response to a clinical hold, if you receive a refuse to file when you submit your marketing application, or a complete response letter. Type A meetings can be opportunities to try to address those issues with FDA if your program is stalled due to these actions. And then a type C meeting, I like to think of as kind of a catch-all for all other situations. So it's not urgent and it's not a milestone meeting, but you still have some questions that you want to clarify with FDA. These can be done during the type C meetings it takes a little bit longer to get those granted, but it's not so much that it should cause delays in your program.
So Mara, one of the questions that I often get asked is, are pre-IND meetings required?
It's a good question. And I'm actually going to address meetings in general. These types of meetings that we're discussing today, none of them are actually required, but the milestone meetings in particular, like pre-IND, are highly recommended. For all of the reasons that Don and I said in the previous slide. I'm not going to repeat myself, but for all of those reasons, we do recommend having those meetings, even if you think your program is straightforward and it shouldn't be needed.
Thank you.
And in addition to those three types of meetings, I'm going to touch upon a couple additional meeting types. The first is a type D. As Mara mentioned, type C kind of is a catch-all, but type D is a newer meeting that's come about in the past couple years that's really intended to be a catch-all, but for a narrow set of topics and questions. And so generally, if you have just a few questions and it doesn't require more than 3 disciplines to review and provide answers, you can consider a type D meeting. As you see from the slide, it has a faster time frame, and so there's some benefit potentially in trying to kind of parcel out issues that you may have into several type D meetings, as you may get responses a little bit faster. The other type of meeting I'm going to touch upon is an interact meeting. Interact meetings have been around for a while. Sometimes they're referred to as pre-IND meetings historically. These originated with the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, initially, to deal with early development issues that come up with complex products like cell and gene therapies. Recently, these were expanded as a meeting option into the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER. And so again, mostly dealing with very early phase type of questions, such as IND enabling tox or complex manufacturing technologies. I did note a few other types of meetings here that are out of scope of our discussion today. Mara mentioned that the meetings that we're going to go into depth discussing today, none of them are required, but I do want to point out in this list that the marketing application review meetings, as well as advisory committee meetings, are not optional.
Thanks for that explanation of the different types of FDA meetings. When should these meetings generally occur during development, and when's the right time to actually request one?
Yeah, so as we alluded to, and we're going to discuss in a little bit more detail, the milestone meetings are normally pretty specific in terms of timing. For other meeting types, development issues tend to present themselves. For example, there may be multiple paths for development, and you need to have more conversation around those options. There may be results from a study that you received that potentially changes your clinical development plans. Potentially, you may see a new impurity, in your drug product or your drug API that necessitates conversation. The key to the timing of meetings, however, is that you really need to have appropriate detailed background materials and a plan available for FDA to review and to supplement your discussion during the meetings.
So some of the meetings you described occur at milestones. Are there some topics that are commonly discussed at each of these development time points rather?
Yeah, there are. So we're going to speak briefly to this slide. There are a lot more bullets than we'll speak to, but it's just in the interest of time. Pre-IND meetings are typically to address any issues prior to entering the clinic, CMC, non-clinical, or the design of your first in human study. End of phase one meetings, these are typically used to confirm a phase two trial that is intended for registration. So the most common area where we see end of phase one meetings is in oncology, but they are for any products intended to treat serious illness where you might be basing your registrational trial off of a phase two.
And as we move on to end of phase two meetings, the primary topics for this meeting is really discussion of the design of your proposed pivotal trials, aligning on all of your efficacy and safety endpoints, as well as confirmation of manufacturing plans going forward. Lastly, I'll touch upon pre-NDA, pre-BLA meetings. Normally, one of the things you do is kind of preview for the agency a little bit the results of your phase three program and discuss with them the adequacy of that data to support a marketing application. This is one of the meetings that is sometimes a little bit more kind of nuts and bolts too, because this is where you get into details around where is data going to be presented? What is this format going to look like? What is the content going to be for my ISS or ISE? Things along those lines too.
Thanks, Don. I appreciate the description. And Mara, can you talk next about the process and timeline for an FDA meeting?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you see on the screen right now, we've taken an example of a type B meeting, which again, as Mara had mentioned, is just one of the common meeting types that we see mostly being due to pre-IND type of activities. Day 0 or day 1 on this starts with submission of the meeting request. For a type B meeting, there is a 60-day targeted timeframe. If you look to the right, you'll see typically FDA is having their final internal review meeting about a week prior to your scheduled meeting date. And then they will provide preliminary responses, normally not less than 2 days prior to the meeting schedule. One thing that's important to note, the submission of the briefing book and the timing of that, which is set here and shown at day 30. If you have your meeting a few days before kind of the maximum targeted time frame, which here is 60 days, that also moves up the submission of your briefing book. And so if you have it on day 54, it's going to move up the submission of your briefing book to day 24. So we should always keep that in mind. The other meetings all have their own specific timeframes, and so I'd refer you to the guidance to see those details.
Thanks, Don. The diagram you're presenting here actually starts with submitting the meeting request. Can you explain a little bit more about what happens generally before that?
Yeah, absolutely. So internally, the sponsor team should be preparing topics, questions, the background, and the rationales they want to provide to FDA for their plans. For meetings where the meeting request and the briefing book are submitted at different time points, such as in this example, the briefing book should be fairly far along, probably 75 to 80% when the meeting request is submitted. And that's really due to the fact that in that meeting request, you need to provide your questions and kind of the scope of the meeting to the agency. And you want those to be as close to final as possible, just in terms of the overall scope.
Thanks. So the process you described sort of assumes that FDA will actually grant a meeting. Is there a chance that FDA can deny a meeting request? And how often does that happen?
So there is certainly a chance that FDA can deny a meeting request, but for the most part, it's unusual. It is not uncommon for a sponsor to request a teleconference or a face-to-face meeting and have FDA convert it to a written responses only type meeting. But it is kind of uncommon for them to deny it altogether. That being said, the exception to that is those interact meetings that Dawn talked about that are earlier in development and talk about kind of complex topics. And the most common reason for those being denied is that the sponsor is too far along in development. Although what I've seen happen recently is FDA converting those meetings to pre-IND instead of interact.
Very good. So earlier you described some of the common topics at these milestone meetings. Can you explain further how you go about identifying topics to discuss at FDA meetings?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we touched upon already, it really depends on the meeting type. Milestone meetings tend to have some specific topics that are addressed at each stage. And as I alluded to earlier, other types of topics tend to present themselves during development. Studies with either unexpectedly bad or unexpectedly good results. Unexpected long-term results from a tox study that's ongoing, kind of in the background of your clinical development program. As you progress through development, there's always, it seems, issues that come up around scale up. Sometimes you reach a point in development where you realize you have to make a formulation change. And so those are all really good times and topics to discuss with the agency. One of the key things to remember when identifying topics is that you need to have a plan for your own proposed path forward instead of asking open-ended questions. And you really need to understand what specific information you want to get from your meeting. So to make sure you get the desired feedback, you should have identified the risks associated within your plan, and in your briefing materials discussed how those risks would be mitigated. And again, just to emphasize, you should prospectively be putting forth your proposal and your plan to FDA in your materials.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that quickly, as I mentioned earlier about guidances that FDA puts out, it is worthwhile for a sponsor to research precedents and guidance from FDA relevant to their program, both the therapeutic area and the product type, and determine whether the path that other sponsors chose is relevant to their program, whether they want to follow it or they want to make any changes to it. And both of those pathways or choices should be discussed with the FDA.
Thanks, Mara. You just commented on the influence of sort of precedents and guidance. If there's already an FDA guidance document or relevant precedents, do you still need to meet with FDA to talk about your program?
I still recommend it based on the reasons that we stated early in the presentation, in particular, Dawn mentioning that it establishes your relationship with the review team. I think that's important to do, especially in the case of a pre-IND meeting, for example. You don't just want to drop an IND in FDA's lap without any notice that it's coming or any introduction to the sponsor and the program.
Thank you. I understand it's important to ask appropriate questions to ensure you have a successful outcome. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so this is kind of the meat of this webinar today, and in my opinion, the most important topic to discuss. So designing your questions in a way that's going to get you clear and actionable answers from FDA is critical for having a successful meeting. So the way to do this is to avoid open-ended questions. If your question is open-ended or overly broad, this can cause problems in the responses you receive. Another point I want to make is that you don't want to ask the FDA to design your program for you. Typically, they'll ask for a number of studies that may be outside of the scope of what you were planning. And the best way to go about asking FDA advice is to already have a plan in place, as Dawn said, and seek their concurrence or agreement. So some examples of like good types of questions to ask, as I've already mentioned, is seeking concurrence on following or not following guidance or precedent. Also seeking concurrence on specific elements of your clinical trial design are good topics, especially for a pre-IND meeting or one of those end of phase meetings that we discussed.
And Mara, do you have kind of an example of a good question?
I do. So I mentioned that overly broad questions are not a good idea. And it's something that would be like an overly broad question is, does FDA agree with our proposed first in human trial? that's a very broad question. And if FDA says, yeah, it generally appears reasonable, you don't know if that applies to every specific detail. And if there is a specific area that you need feedback on, that's the question you need to ask. So an example would be if you've got questions about your inclusion exclusion criteria, if you think there's something in there that might be problematic, then you ask a specific question about the inclusion exclusion criteria rather than a broad question about the entire protocol.
Yeah, and I think, the exact opposite of what you're describing, Mara, in terms of, what is a bad question? The most common bad question is one that's overly broad, as we've, hit upon multiple times here. The other thing I think is not, a good plan is repeating a question that you've asked in a previous meeting without having additional data to try and maybe influence FDA's opinion and response. The other thing, and we've touched upon precedence a couple times as well so far in the discussion. Precedence is a great thing, but you want to make sure that if you're requesting FDA concurrence based solely on an approach taken by a different sponsor, that you're laying out how your product and your situation is actually applicable to that precedent. So it needs to be kind of well researched, well thought out, and well supported that that precedent is actually applicable to your situation.
Good points. Do you have an example of a good question?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, a bad question.
Bad question. Yeah. I'd seen a recent example where the question was, what type of preclinical efficacy data does FDA expect to see for this program? As we've talked about, that's really, really broad. That's allowing the agency to essentially design your program for you rather than you putting forth a plan and saying, do you concur? And you may see some, results and responses that you're not expecting.
So you made the comment that you want to avoid bad questions. What's the danger of doing that?
There's several dangers of doing that. So FDA, as Dawn said, could ask for additional studies or study types that you weren't planning to conduct. They may not answer the question at all. I have definitely seen FDA decline to answer a question based on lack of information or unclear question. It's true also that if you ask a vague or broad question, you might get a vague answer that doesn't really help you with your product development. You can also get an answer that you don't want to hear, as Dawn just mentioned. That can happen even with a good question, but at least with the good questions, you do end up with clear and actionable advice.
Very good. I want to just follow up on that a little bit. So one of the questions I've heard from sponsors is what happens when you get advice that you don't want, and what happens if you choose not to follow it?
That's probably, a really good point for discussion during the meeting if you're receiving this information as in your preliminary feedback. It could be a situation where FDA is, wrong on their advice. It could be a situation where they have maybe misinterpreted something that was in your documentation, or it may be a situation where they just didn't see part of your argument regarding the situation. If you submit a really, really large briefing package, there's a good chance that the agency is not going to read every single, ounce of that package. They're going to go look for the parts that directly address the question they're assigned to reply to. And it's easy for the agency to kind of miss pieces when your packages are too large as well. It could be a situation where it actually makes sense to do it their way. But it's important to remember that if you decide you're not going to follow FDA advice, you really do need to have strong rationale and scientific justification for doing so.
So given that there's some important strategy involved in developing questions, are there some best practices in terms of writing FDA questions that you can share?
Sorry, I apologize for my delay there. Yeah, there are some best practices. As we mentioned, you want to be specific with your questions. You don't want them to be overly broad. Often what I found is it's really helpful to include some of the rationale within the question or within a preamble to the question. So where possible, the company should make proposals and then ask if the FDA concurs, and that proposal should be part of that preamble.
Yeah, and to just touch upon, I think, a few more kind of logistical type of issues as well. Questions should really cross-reference the relevant background sections in your briefing document where the majority of the data and argument will reside. Make sure you number all of your questions sequentially, so don't have a number one in the clinical section and a number one in the preclinical section also. It just kind of gets confusing at times. And make sure you keep the background introducing the question brief. The data that supports the question should be provided in the briefing package. And as I mentioned a minute ago, you've got to kind of balance that information as well. If you send FDA too much extraneous information, you risk the reviewers not going into detail and seeing the important points that you want them to take into consideration.
Very good. Thanks. Those are good tips in terms of developing successful questions. I want to move next to addressing what are some of the critical success factors to conducting an FDA meeting. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to touch upon the activities that happen before the meeting actually takes place. So the first step is submitting that meeting request, as we've touched upon. The request should be organized as described in the guidance. It's largely an administrative document in its details, but the main objective is really to justify the need for a meeting and also to identify the scope of that meeting. And so that includes identifying the disciplines and the key issues for discussions. I think probably the really key component of the meeting request is the questions and that, brief preamble or rationale that accompanies them. Again, these they must clearly articulate the need for a meeting. As I touched upon before, the questions should be close to final, and you do not need full background information in the meeting request. The most critical consideration regarding the questions laid out in the meeting request is that you don't want to add a question into your briefing document that's outside of the original scope of the meeting request. That may mean that FDA has to then add new people or new disciplines that weren't originally planned for, and that's not going to be well received, and they may refuse to answer questions like that. You need to propose your timing. So we talked about these schedules and time frames from the guidance that FDA needs to adhere to. And so you should propose a meeting that is within those time frames. If you propose a time frame that's beyond the target laid out in the guidance, FDA may deny that and ask you to resubmit when you can kind of fulfill your commitments within the time frame. You'll choose what type, or you'll suggest, I should say, what type of meeting format you want. So there's face-to-face, there's virtual face-to-face, there's teleconferences, and there's written responses only. It is, worth noting that a high proportion of meetings right now are granted as written response only. So you should plan accordingly, which means really being diligent about clarity of questions and the background. You do have the ability to ask a clarifying question after receiving written response, but you really want to make sure that the information you're presenting is clear from the beginning to avoid any misunderstandings. The written responses follow the same timelines as we've laid out for each type of meeting.
So, if I understand correctly, sometimes you can actually request a meeting that would involve a discussion, like a video or an in-person meeting, and FDA grants it as a written response only. Is that a bad outcome? And is there anything that you should do to convince FDA to grant it as a teleconference, video conference, or a face-to-face?
I don't think getting a written response only is necessarily a bad outcome, but you should remember that the request is really the only place you get to make your case prior to a decision being made by FDA on what type of meeting they will grant. I recommend that sometimes you specifically call out topics in your meeting request that may benefit from discussion, such as a place where you want to maybe include different endpoints from what's been done previously, or you have endpoints that may not have been studied before. There'll likely be a subset of your questions that cannot be answered clearly in writing, and so pointing those out, I think, is beneficial.
So Dawn, if for whatever reason the agency does grant the meeting as written responses only, but the sponsor really feels that they would benefit greatly from an actual discussion, is there any recourse after the meeting has been granted to getting it changed?
Yeah, and in preparation, we all discussed. I think we've all done this before. You can go back to the project manager, make your case for having some other type of meeting. I will caveat and say that, our collective experience recently has not been very successful in doing that, but there's certainly no downside, and that would be your avenue is to go back to the regulatory project manager to have that discussion.
Thanks.
Yeah, and for clarification, so we've been unsuccessful in being able to get written response only meetings converted to in-person or
Correct.
video meetings. But after the fact, after you get the written responses, we have had them agree to various modalities for giving us clarification. And it varies from division to division.
Yeah, yeah, good point. Thanks, Mark.
Yep. Yeah.
Lastly, a few points on the briefing book before we move on. Again, it's organized according to the FDA guidance. And the content should be developed to support the questions that you are asking. FDA only, normally reads the background that is needed to answer the questions that are posed. And so this is not the place to do like a complete development, data dump. The agency doesn't need the background on every single thing that you've done. They need the background that relates to the specific questions that you're asking. It should be a standalone document also. The agency and the reviewers shouldn't have to go look elsewhere to help find supporting information to answer your question. We've touched upon this several times. It should be as concise as possible. And that's a very delicate balance, as everyone knows. Lastly, I suggest trying to identify any potential challenges, and Mara's going to talk about this a little bit in more detail on the next slide. Do this prior to submitting your briefing book. Kind of look for gaps, look for weaknesses. Your team knows the project better than anybody, and so you also probably know the likely pitfalls or likely weaknesses in your arguments. And so make sure that your briefing book very thoroughly kind of addresses those weaknesses when it is submitted.
So if you're getting written responses only, then the plan is that you just wait for the response to come via email. But assuming that you're going to have a discussion with the FDA, what are some of the best practices in terms of meeting conduct and preparing minutes?
Yeah, and this is the point that Dawn raised in terms of what I'd be speaking to on this slide. So the first point in terms of preparation and conduct for the actual meeting with FDA is having rehearsals. Now, historically, these rehearsals were trying to make up any questions or challenges FDA could present and then figure out how you would respond to them. But it's been quite a while now that FDA has been issuing preliminary responses 2 to 3 days prior to the meeting itself. And so that kind of make up the challenges and then figure out how to respond to them situation is gone. However, it is still important to rehearse and be ready for the face-to-face meeting. And so that first rehearsal, as Dawn said, where you identify issues and challenges that are likely to occur, should happen prior to dispatch of the briefing book for the exact reason that Dawn mentioned, which is to make sure that you try to address all of that upfront within the briefing book so that FDA has all of that information at their disposal. The second rehearsal, I typically recommend that sponsors discuss, what the delivery of the responses is going to look like and identify the most critical issues. So, if you've asked a question about non-clinical development and FDA is possibly going to come back and request another animal study, for example, and you're willing to do that, then that might not be a critical issue that's going to need discussion. But if you've got a question that you've asked that if a no from FDA could be a program killer, that's a critical question, and you need to be ready with your backup plans if FDA doesn't like your initial plan. You need to be ready to discuss those and have any counterpoints ready ahead of time. So that's kind of what we use the second rehearsal for, is to identify those more critical components. The third and final rehearsals, I typically recommend occur as mock meetings. So you've identified who's going to speak to any topic. You've got somebody to kind of facilitate the meeting, and you just walk through any questions that you've identified for discussion and who's going to speak when. This is a point where you can potentially raise items that FDA might have as issues with your backup plan or with your counterpoints and figure out how you might address those. During the final rehearsal, you'll also want to, again, review those preliminary responses from FDA decide the seating chart if it's a face-to-face meeting, finalize your backup positions, and if you've got some sort of document or PowerPoint presentation where you're raising counterpoints, make sure that you're sending those back to FDA with enough time for them to review before the meeting. Some best practices include contacting the project manager to confirm when preliminary responses will be sent. After review of the preliminary responses, it's good to contact the project manager to identify the subset of questions that require discussion at the meeting. You do also need to confirm your final list of attendees with the project manager.
So you don't need to discuss every question that you raised originally, it sounds like. What about the ones that you actually choose not to discuss in the meeting?
So for the questions that you choose not to discuss in the meeting, typically, if you send back, a PowerPoint response or any sort of document that tells FDA which questions you're going to address, this is when I typically will say, question 1, no discussion required. Thank you for your response. Some other good points for best practices include keeping introductions short. And in fact, I will mention that if you're doing a Zoom or a video conference, most times the regulatory project manager on FDA side will ask that we don't do introductions, but when you speak, that you say your name and your role. In general, it's not a good idea to give a general presentation. You've presented all of your background information in the briefing package, and so a presentation about the program itself is not necessary. However, I have mentioned previously that you could use a PowerPoint as a way to have counterpoints to FDA's preliminary responses. If you want to, those can be projected live, but typically not. The discussion will typically center around the open questions. So anything that you've identified as a question that needs discussion, the FDA, after introductions, if there are any, will hand over the discussion to the sponsor. So typically someone who's facilitating the meeting will then guide the discussion through each individual question. If you do have any sort of visual aids, or as I mentioned, something where you're mentioning counterpoints, those should be sent to the project manager in advance, or you can bring paper copies to hand out. It's also important at the end of the meeting to have the meeting facilitator summarize any conclusions or agreements. This is actually really critical to make sure that anything that you think you heard in terms of agreement from FDA is what you actually heard, and that they agree that that is the discussion and the conclusion that you came to. Some of the divisions, in particular the oncology divisions, will do live minutes. These are projected. You can see what the person taking the minutes is writing down, and you can even have a discussion if you feel like you heard something different than what they're writing down. It's actually really nice to have it done this way, but there are several divisions that don't do it this way, and if live minutes are not occurring, then that summary at the end is really critical. It's important to mention that for most face-to-face meetings these days, they're hybrid. So a portion of the participants will join via Zoom. Only key participants tend to be on site for these face-to-face FDA meetings these days. Not all FDA folks are coming into the office every day anymore. Once you've had the FDA meeting, it is important to debrief. So find a meeting area, post after the meeting is over, and make sure that everyone on the sponsor team is aligned as to what was heard. And if you are going to be preparing and submitting minutes, you can start working on those. One thing I do recommend if the minutes are not done live is that you want to try to get your minutes in before FDA issues theirs, because that way you're at least on paper getting down what you heard during the meeting, and there's the hope that it might influence FDA's minutes.
Thanks, Mara. Can you maybe just comment briefly on who leads the discussion with the FDA, assuming that you're having a discussion?
Yeah, so I've mentioned a few times a facilitator. So this is typically someone like one of the three of us, a regulatory strategist who has a lot of experience interacting with FDA. This person can be an external consultant that you bring in, like someone from the quantum team, or it could be somebody from the sponsor side who, again, has experience interacting with FDA. This is a person who can kind of help lead and guide the discussion in case you've got folks that, maybe get a little off topic or talk a little too long, and you've only got an hour. So you want to make, most of the time you only have an hour. So you want to make best use of that time.
And how is the room typically set up? Is there any protocol for who sits where? Is there a projector, et cetera?
There is typically a projector, and in cases where it's a hybrid meeting, as I mentioned, there's going to be a screen with video participants involved as well. If you're in a face-to-face meeting, the room typically has a very large conference table. And what I've seen is that FDA tends to sit on one side, the sponsor on the other side. There's also like a back row kind of against the wall behind the conference table. So it is important before going to the meeting to determine who's sitting at the table and who's kind of in the background. And typically that is the folks that have speaking roles are the ones that should sit at the table.
Very good. Before we proceed, I just want to remind everyone that we do have the ability to take questions from you. So if you have any questions, please insert them in the comments on LinkedIn. We'll come back to that in the Q&A session at the end. So just to continue, assuming that we're actually granted a teleconference or a video conference, are there some additional points to consider versus an in-person meeting?
Yeah, absolutely. So the person who will facilitate really needs to know their team and understand who potentially is likely to go off on a tangent and be able to manage that. I think as we've all learned, in these post-COVID years, probably the hardest part about video conferences is not being in the same room with people and not being able to give nonverbal clues to either halt or accelerate someone's discussion or points that they're making. So it's important to make sure no one is monopolizing the conversation. One of the things we've been recommending is that if possible, the sponsor team should actually meet in a central location. That gives you the ability to kind of use more of those nonverbal cues if your team is sitting in one location or the majority of your team is in one location. It's also beneficial to have kind of a separate chat line for offline conversations. The one thing on this is just making sure there's not excessive chatter going on because it can be extremely distracting to try and listen to an FDA conversation with people, sending all kinds of messages in the background. And as Mara, pointed out, in those last couple of rehearsals, it's really critical to know how your people are going to respond. And so you should be able to gain that information and kind of know who you have to hurt a little bit and know who you have to help a little bit as it comes to the time to do the real meeting.
Very good. Well, we want to end our webinar today with a case study to illustrate some of the points that came up in the context of our conversation. So Mara, can you maybe walk us through that?
Sure, I'm happy to. So the case study example I wanted to give is from an FDA meeting that I led several years ago, where we felt pretty confident in our program. We felt confident in the questions that we were asking, and we felt confident that we were going to get FDA concurrence or agreement. When we received the preliminary comments, there was a very surprising response from FDA on one of them. I'm not going to go into too much detail in the interest of time, but it was in our minds, it was possible that FDA had kind of misunderstood the question or was overlooking some information that we presented in our briefing package. So we spent a good portion, most of our rehearsals for this FDA meeting focused on that one question and that one response. And as I mentioned, you can submit to FDA kind of PowerPoint slides or some form of issuing counterpoints prior to having the actual meeting, which is what we chose to do. So we spent a couple of days going through what our counterpoints were to the FDA response. We spent a good amount of time rehearsing how we were going to speak to it in the meeting live. In fact, I think we spent the bulk of our last rehearsal focused on that. And went back and forth on possible things that FDA could come back with to our counterpoints and just really rehearsing all of that. But the key thing that we did was we submitted this counterpoint document ahead of time so that when we actually entered the room and sat down at the table and began to start to discuss this question, I think I was leading the discussion. And so I brought it up and I started to talk through it, and FDA interrupted and was like, "You are right. We were wrong. Your proposal is fine. Just go forward with that." And so it meant that all the rehearsing we did was no longer necessary, but we were really glad that we had spent that time and had submitted our counterpoints early so that FDA could review those. And then we were able to spend the rest of the meeting discussing, the format and content of the NDA that was coming out.
So they actually reviewed the materials you sent in advance, came into the meeting well prepared, and that preempted the need to have the conversation.
They did, but I'm going to caveat that we gave them plenty of time. I think if we had sent those kind of counterpoints just a few hours before the meeting, there's a possibility they would not have reviewed. But I think we submitted 24 hours in advance.
Very good. Yeah, I think that's good practice. Okay, so I think we're now going to move to Q&A. I'm going to give everybody a couple of minutes to put questions into the comment area within LinkedIn. If you have any, we certainly welcome you to do that. While I'm looking through that, I'm going to ask Mara and Don if they have any kind of overall concluding remarks.
Mara, did you want to take that or?
Sure. Sorry. Sure. From my perspective, I think in terms of concluding remarks, preparation is crucial. You want to make sure that you're aligned on your approach. You want to anticipate challenges to allow the best response, and you need to start early. A lot of times, sponsors will come to us and they want an FDA meeting in 2 months, and they don't have the questions yet, and they don't have a briefing package started. So it's really important to kind of get those things in gear before you actually request a meeting. Time goes very fast. So you need to make sure that you keep the discussion focused and that nobody's going off on any tangents. As Don mentioned, during the rehearsals, you can usually tell who those folks might be and be prepared to kind of step in if needed. And you need to have somebody watch the clock.
Very good. I'm going to start off with a couple of questions. So if you're granted a pre-IND meeting and there's a need for follow-up prior to submitting an IND, will FDA grant you a second one
A second pre-IND meeting?
or a second meeting in general?
Typically, yes, you are able to get more than one meeting prior to submitting your IND. The guidance states, or it's general understanding that milestone meetings you only get one. That being said, I have been able to successfully convince review teams to grant another pre-IND meeting if the program has changed since the first one. But you can follow up with maybe a type D meeting if your topics are narrow, or a type C meeting.
So I have another question here. So if you would like to include a patient or a key opinion leader in the meeting with FDA, is that acceptable?
I think it's acceptable as long as the topics that they're speaking to are, focused and relevant to your questions and your discussion point, right? They need to be adding relevant and appropriate context to the discussion.
Very good. So for companies that are going through the drug approval process, how soon should you get started preparing for FDA meetings? Are there key points or milestones where you would say you should get started now? When should you start preparing for these meetings relative to where you are in development, I guess is the general question.
Mark, do you mind just repeating the question? I'm not sure I followed all components
Yeah,
of it.
no, so I think that the question that's been posed is like during the drug approval process, how soon should you get started preparing for FDA meetings? Like when should you start thinking about your interactions with the FDA? Is that something you start very early? Just like 2 months prior to submitting the IND is the first time you give thought to that? Like when should you be thinking about this?
I think the answer depends on the milestone meeting. So if it is a pre-IND and you're getting ready to start your first in human clinical trial, I think it's really good to start thinking about that as far in advance as possible. Like as you're working on your non-clinical program, as you're starting your GMP manufacturing, identifying any potential risks or challenges as those things are ongoing, and kind of making note that you might need to confirm that your plan is okay with FDA. So I would say for pre-IND, you're talking 6 months to a year in advance of wanting to submit your IND, if not longer. The other milestone meetings, it depends on how your program is developing, but I certainly, as you gave a 2 month time clock there, Mark, as an example, and I certainly would not wait until 2 months before any given action, the start of your pivotal trial or the planned submission of a marketing application. I would give it, in general, I'd say 3 to 6 months to be
And I
really
think it's
considering.
I'm sorry, I think it's even more important for some of the later stage meetings too, right? You're not going to put a couple months worth of planning into an end of phase two meeting because you're essentially laying out, your design for phase three, which is very, very complex. You're summarizing all of the reasons and all of the data why you have the doses that you do. That's from your phase one and phase two data, and so there's a very data heavy, component to end of phase two meetings, as well as pre-NDA meetings, is fits into the same category. Essentially, you're making kind of your last pitch. You're filling in any gaps if there were any outstanding questions that the agency has asked along the way. You're providing justification for why you've done it a certain way or maybe not done it at all. So those are really critical meetings that have a lot of preparation and data handling that go into them.
I think one other thing that kind of plays into this is just the concept of prospectively planning from a regulatory perspective for the overall development plan. So putting together a regulatory development plan, it may be that very early in development, you're thinking about issues that may not need to be de-risked with FDA until much later in development, but you want to make sure you don't lose sight of those things.
It's
There
a
may
really
be
good point.
critical claims that you want to make in the label to differentiate your product from another product that's already on the market. And it may be, you can't ask that at a pre-IND meeting. FDA is going to say it's premature to have that conversation, but you need to be prepared to have that conversation later. You need to have specific proposed language, and a pre-NDA meeting or maybe an end of phase two conference is actually the place to have those kinds of conversations. But so it's good to be thinking about those things early.
Yeah, and Mike, I think just along those same lines to your point, we have different types of clients that we end up interacting with, right? We have some who, while they may be small and they may be early in the development, stage that they're at, if you have regulatory input, it kind of has you thinking about all of these things from the very beginning, and you have less of a chance of getting to a kind of a critical time point or milestone decision point, and then saying, "Oh my God, we didn't think about X, Y, and Z." And so when you have that regulatory input, whether it's from within your company or from external consultants, that really does help in the planning of the activities, even when you're very, very early on in development.
Agreed.
Very good. So let's take a moment and talk a little bit further about written responses only. So you mentioned in the course of the presentation that many meetings with FDA these days are relegated to written responses only. And I'm guessing that in a lot of cases we get responses that we either don't like or that are unclear. We talked a little bit about the process for seeking clarification. Can you guys just talk a little bit about how that typically works? Have you had experience seeking clarification? How'd that play out?
Yeah, I think I'll start with this one. So technically, you have 20 days to request clarifications, and the word clarification is very important, right? This isn't necessarily your time to go back and argue with the overall holistic response you got. It's not the time to go back, present additional data that you think, supports your argument more. You should have done that in your briefing book, right? If you had that information available. I have noted that the FDA has been a little bit more of a stickler about this 20-day window for asking your clarifying questions. So stick to that time frame. They have the option to not respond to them if you submit your questions outside of the 20-day window. That's not to say if you're for some reason outside of that window, you shouldn't submit. You might as well. They may choose to respond to those.
Is that
I
mostly
wanted to
written?
raise,
Oh, no, go ahead,
go ahead.
Mara.
I was
No,
just
go
going to
ahead.
raise another point based off an experience that I had, which is to keep the number of questions that you ask following written responses only as limited as possible. So I did have one situation where we responded right away with a follow-up question, and the regulatory project manager sent it on to the review team, and they were reviewing it. And then the sponsor asked me to submit two more questions. And at that point, FDA came back and said, submit another meeting request. So it got, I think, a little bit too much in terms of how much clarification we were seeking.
And I think consolidation of those questions is also key too, right? You might have gotten a different response if you'd have had all your questions together at one time
Yes,
and done one
agreed.
submission. So.
Agreed.
Have you found generally that the follow-up to written responses only is also in writing, or have you had experience with them granting like a follow-up call? I don't know what your experience has been in that context.
My experience has been written feedback
Mine
still,
too.
for those clarifications.
Yeah, that's my understanding. Is in most cases they do. The sense that I get is that the divisions vary a little bit in terms of how they handle these things, and they try and tailor the follow up to the nature of the question. If it requires some conversation, I think they're generally willing to try and set that up. But logistically, that's more challenging, and I think most often the time it's in writing. Okay, looking, I don't see any further questions in the comments on LinkedIn. I don't know, Mara, Don, anything else that you think warrants mention before we just kind of wrap things up?
I don't have any further comments.
I think I'm
Okay.
good, thank you.
Well, we sincerely appreciate those of you who took the time out of your schedules to join us for the webinar today. Hope you found some useful nuggets in terms of approaches to FDA meetings that may be helpful in the future. If there are things that we can do to help support you in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out. Our contact information is located on this slide, and you can reach out via email, or we also have a website that you can contact us via. So. I think we'll wrap things up for today, and we wish you guys a wonderful rest of your Friday and a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mark and
Thank you.
Don.